Welcome to the inner sanctum of the audiobook empire. The person who talks the most in the room is not the most powerful. They are the most anxious. Real power sits in calculated silence and speaks only once, and that single truth alone is enough to redraw the map of every professional relationship you have built until today. 95% of people negotiate in a way that makes the other party win automatically, not because they are weak, but because they do not realize they started losing before they ever opened their mouths. And what is more dangerous than the loss itself is the false sense of security that accompanies it. If you need other people's approval to validate your decisions, you have not built an identity yet. You have built a dependency. The person you think is confident in your circle most likely does not possess confidence at all. They possess trained indifference, engineered with precision and deliberate practice. The difference between the two does not reveal itself in ordinary moments. It reveals itself the instant pressure is applied, and everything collapses within seconds. There is one sentence, if spoken at the beginning of any negotiation, that makes the other party feel they are in control, while you are the one orchestrating everything from behind an invisible curtain. This sentence is not magic. It's linguistic engineering built on a deep understanding of how the brain functions under the pressure of decision. And the book you are about to hear today is not taught in MBA programs for one reason only, because it explains how the game works from the inside, in a language never designed for the general public. This content is not for those seeking morning motivation that evaporates before noon. This is for those who have made a final, irreversible decision to understand how social dominance is built scientifically and systematically, far beyond empty slogans and packaged advice. If you are comfortable in your life right now and feel no internal friction whatsoever, close this video. But if you feel there's another level you have not yet reached, a level seen by few and lived by even fewer, continue, because what follows was engineered for you alone. Every single day you pass without understanding these rules, someone else is understanding them and applying them to you in complete silence. This is not a theoretical assumption, and it's not rhetorical exaggeration. This is what is happening right now in every boardroom, at every negotiation table, and in every relationship where one party believes the dynamic is equal. The money you did not earn this month did not vanish into thin air. It went to someone who knows one rule you do not know yet, and it will keep going to them for as long as this cognitive gap remains open. You have been making decisions your entire life under a fundamental misconception about how your mind works, a misconception so deeply embedded in the way you experience your own thinking that correcting it does not feel like acquiring new information. It feels like dismantling something. The misconception is this: that you have a mind and that mind thinks, and that the thinking it does is broadly unified, coherent, and under your conscious direction when the situation demands it. Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist whose decades of empirical research into human judgment earned him the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, spent his career systematically dismantling this misconception with a precision and a depth of evidential support that has permanently restructured the scientific understanding of human cognition. What he found is not that the mind thinks poorly, or that it is subject to occasional errors that careful attention can prevent. What he found is that the mind does not think in the unified way the misconception assumes at all, that it is instead two fundamentally different systems operating simultaneously, with different speeds, different mechanisms, different strengths, different failure modes, and a relationship between them that is far more complex, far more asymmetric, and far more consequential for every decision you make than any model of unified rational cognition can accommodate. Kahneman designated these two systems with deliberate simplicity, System 1 and System 2, and the simplicity of the labels is itself a strategic choice, because the concepts they represent are radical enough in their implications without the additional cognitive load of technical nomenclature.
System 1 is the fast mind. It operates automatically, continuously, and almost entirely below the threshold of conscious awareness. It does not require effort, does not demand attention, and cannot be voluntarily switched off. It is running right now as you process these words, making dozens of micro-assessments, activating associative networks, generating emotional responses, constructing rapid interpretations of ambiguous inputs, and delivering its conclusions to consciousness, not as tentative hypotheses to be evaluated, but as immediate perceptions of reality that feel as direct and as reliable as the sensation of temperature or the experience of color. System 1 is not a deliberative process. It is a perception engine, and like all perception engines, it delivers its outputs with a confidence that is entirely independent of their accuracy. System 2 is the slow mind. It is the system you experience as thinking, the deliberate, effortful, sequential processing of information that you consciously direct toward problems that exceed System 1's automatic pattern matching capacity. Solving a complex mathematical problem, evaluating the terms of a contract, constructing a strategic argument from first principles, navigating an unfamiliar city without GPS. These are System 2 tasks, tasks that require the sustained, directed allocation of cognitive resources that System 2 provides and System 1 cannot. But System 2 has a property that is as consequential as any of its capabilities. It is profoundly, constitutionally lazy. Not lazy in the colloquial sense, a character flaw. Lazy in the precise technical sense that it requires metabolic resources to operate. Those resources are limited, and the cognitive architecture governing their allocation has a powerful default preference for conserving them whenever System 1 can provide an answer that is good enough to satisfy the immediate demand. This laziness is not a design flaw. It is a design feature, and understanding why it is a feature rather than a flaw is essential to understanding the full strategic implications of the two-system architecture. The human brain consumes approximately 20% of the body's total energy budget, despite representing only 2% of its mass. Sustained System 2 operation is metabolically expensive in ways that cannot be maintained indefinitely without cognitive fatigue and performance degradation. The architecture that defaults to System 1 whenever possible and deploys System 2 only when necessary is an energy management system of extraordinary efficiency, one that allows complex organisms to navigate enormously complex environments without burning through their cognitive fuel reserves on problems that pattern recognition can solve adequately. The catastrophic limitation of this architecture emerges precisely in the environments where modern high-stakes decisions are made. Environments where the problems that feel most tractable to System 1's pattern recognition are frequently the problems where System 1's rapid, confident, and effortless conclusions are most systematically wrong. The interaction between the two systems is not a partnership of equals. It is a relationship of asymmetric authority, in which System 1 sets the agenda, frames the questions, generates the initial answers, and delivers them to System 2 as starting points for evaluation, starting points that System 2, in its chronic laziness, accepts far more often than the accuracy of System 1's outputs actually warrant. This asymmetry is the foundational source of virtually every cognitive bias, every systematic judgment error, and every category of decision failure that the behavioral economics literature has documented with such devastating empirical thoroughness over the past half-century. Understanding it is not optional for anyone who claims to make decisions with strategic clarity. It is the prerequisite for everything else. Part 2. System 1, the automatic machine that runs your life without your permission. There is a machine operating inside your skull right now that you did not build, cannot shut down, and have almost no direct authority over, and it is making the overwhelming majority of the judgments, assessments, and decisions that determine your life.
The actual trajectory of your professional performance, your relationships, your financial outcomes, and your perception of reality itself. It is not malfunctioning. It is performing exactly as it was designed to perform, with extraordinary speed, extraordinary confidence, and an almost complete absence of the accuracy checks that the complexity of modern decision environments actually requires. This is System 1, the automatic, intuitive, associative, emotional processing architecture that Kahneman identified as the dominant cognitive force in human life, not because it is more powerful than System 2 in any absolute sense, but because it is always on, always generating outputs, always delivering conclusions, and almost never flagging those conclusions as provisional, uncertain, or in need of verification before they are acted upon. The architecture of System 1 is built on associative networks, vast, densely interconnected webs of concepts, memories, emotions, sensory experiences, and behavioral patterns that have been linked together through repeated co-activation over the course of a lifetime of experience. When any element of one of these networks is activated by a word, an image, a smell, a social cue, a tone of voice, a physical sensation, the activation spreads automatically and instantaneously through the connected network, bringing associated concepts and emotional responses to a heightened state of cognitive accessibility without any conscious direction or deliberate effort. This is what Kahneman calls priming, and its implications for every high-stakes professional interaction you will ever have are both immediate and profound. Priming means that the context in which any piece of information is encountered, the words used immediately before it, the physical environment in which it is presented, the emotional state of the person receiving it, the associative network activated by incidental features of the presentation, shapes the interpretation of that information at a level that precedes and overrides conscious analytical evaluation. In a negotiation context, this means that the frame established in the opening moments of an interaction, the anchoring number first introduced, the emotional tone first set, the associative network first activated, shapes every subsequent judgment made by both parties in ways that neither party can fully access or correct through deliberate analytical effort. The negotiator who understands priming and deploys it with precision is not merely using a persuasion technique. They are operating at the level of cognitive architecture, shaping the associative environment within which their counterpart's System 1 will process every subsequent piece of information in the interaction. The second foundational feature of System 1 is what Kahneman identifies as the law of least effort applied to cognitive processing, the automatic tendency to substitute an easier question for a harder one when the harder one exceeds System 1's processing capacity. When System 1 encounters a question it cannot answer directly from existing associative networks. What is the probability that this investment will generate the projected return? What is the likelihood that this candidate will perform effectively in this role? What is the actual risk profile of this strategic initiative? It does not flag the question as exceeding its competence and defer to System 2. It substitutes a related but fundamentally different question that its associative networks can answer immediately. How does this investment feel? How much do I like this candidate? How familiar does this strategic direction seem? And delivers the answer to the substituted question as if it were the answer to the original one. This substitution happens automatically, below the threshold of conscious awareness, and the answer it produces carries the same phenomenological character of direct perception as any other System 1 output. It feels like a judgment about the original question, rather than a response to a completely different one. The third feature is what Kahneman calls YSIATA. What you see is all there is. The automatic System 1 assumption that the information currently available is the complete information relevant to any judgment being made.
System 1 does not flag the absence of information it does not have. It does not generate uncertainty signals based on what it cannot see. It constructs the most coherent, most confident narrative possible from whatever information is currently activated in the associative network, and it delivers that narrative as a complete picture of reality rather than as a partial sample of a larger information space whose unseen components might fundamentally alter the conclusion. This feature is the foundational mechanism behind overconfidence, not overconfidence as a character trait of the arrogant, but overconfidence as a structural feature of a cognitive system that is architecturally incapable of representing its own ignorance accurately. The fourth feature is the affect heuristic, the automatic System 1 tendency to use current emotional state as a primary input into judgments that have no logical connection to that emotional state. People evaluate risks as lower and benefits as higher when they are in positive emotional states, and evaluate the same risks as higher and the same benefits as lower when they are in negative emotional states. Not because the objective risk-benefit profile of the situation has changed, but because System 1 is using emotional valence as a proxy for objective assessment in a way that feels indistinguishable from genuine analytical judgment. In investment contexts, this means that market sentiment, a collective emotional state, systematically distorts risk assessment across entire populations of sophisticated financial professionals simultaneously, producing the coordinated mispricing that creates both bubbles and crashes. In negotiation contexts, it means that the emotional state you bring into an interaction or that your counterpart introduces,
through deliberate framing, shapes the substantive judgments on both sides of the table in ways that neither party is equipped to detect or correct in real time. Understanding System 1 is not an academic exercise in cognitive psychology. It is a forensic analysis of the actual mechanism driving the most consequential judgments in your professional life. Judgments that feel like the product of rational analysis, but are, in the majority of cases, the product of automatic pattern matching, associative activation, question substitution, and emotional heuristics operating at speeds and in dimensions that conscious deliberation never reaches. The professional who understands this mechanism does not merely make better personal decisions. They develop the capacity to read the System 1 dynamics operating in every interaction they are part of, to see the priming effects, the substitutions, the WSI-ATI constraints, and the affect heuristics that are shaping the judgments of every person in the room, including themselves. In the next part, we turn to System 2. The slow, deliberate, effortful analytical mind that should be running your most important decisions and is almost never actually doing so, and why its chronic laziness is the most expensive cognitive habit you have never tried to correct. There is a cognitive capability residing within your neural architecture that is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most sophisticated information processing systems that biological evolution has ever produced. A system capable of abstract reasoning, probabilistic inference, multivariable optimization, logical deduction from first principles, and the kind of sustained analytical engagement with complex problems that has produced every significant intellectual achievement in human history. It is available to you right now, in this moment, at full operational capacity. And the empirical evidence accumulated across decades of rigorous cognitive research suggests that you are using it for approximately 5% of the decisions that actually warrant its deployment, delegating the remaining 95% to a faster, more confident, and dramatically less accurate system that steps in not because it is better suited to the task, but because it is cheaper to run and easier to access. This is System 2.
the slow, deliberate, effortful analytical mind that Kahneman identified as the cognitive resource most chronically underdeployed in human decision-making, and whose systematic underdeployment is responsible for a category of professional performance failures that no amount of additional information, additional experience, or additional technical expertise can correct without first addressing the fundamental architecture of how cognitive resources are allocated under real-world conditions. System 2's defining characteristic is effort, genuine, measurable, metabolically expensive cognitive effort that manifests in ways that are both subjectively experienced and objectively observable. When System 2 is fully engaged, pupils dilate measurably in response to the increased cognitive load. Heart rate changes. The capacity for parallel processing of environmental stimuli degrades, a phenomenon Kahneman illustrates with the now famous experiment in which subjects deeply engaged in a demanding mental task fail to notice a person in a gorilla suit walking through their visual field. These are not metaphors for cognitive engagement. They are physiological signatures of a system consuming real metabolic resources in quantities that the brain's energy management architecture is specifically designed to minimize through the preferential use of System 1, whenever its outputs are adequate to satisfy the immediate demand. The laziness of System 2 is not uniform across all types of demands or all individuals. Kahneman identifies what he calls cognitive ease, a state in which System 1 is processing fluently, generating outputs without friction, and experiencing no internal signals that would trigger System 2 engagement, as the default cognitive state that the brain actively seeks to maintain. Cognitive ease feels good. It feels like clarity, like confidence, like the smooth operation of a well-functioning mind. And it is, in many contexts, exactly that, a reliable signal that familiar patterns are being processed accurately by a system that has been trained on sufficient relevant experience to handle them well. The problem is that cognitive ease also occurs in contexts where System 1 is processing fluently not because it is accurate, but because the information environment has been designed, deliberately or accidentally, to minimize the friction signals that would trigger System 2 engagement. A message presented in clear, readable font triggers less System 2 engagement than the same message presented in degraded font, not because the content is more credible, but because the processing is more fluent. A claim that rhymes is judged as more likely to be true than an equivalent claim that does not rhyme, not because rhyme is evidence of accuracy, but because it processes more easily. These are not trivial laboratory curiosities. They are demonstrations of a general principle whose implications extend into every domain where the presentation of information shapes the quality of the judgments made about it. The deployment of System 2 is triggered by specific conditions that signal to the brain's resource allocation system that the automatic outputs of System 1 are insufficient for the demands of the current situation. Surprise is one trigger. When System 1's predictions are violated by an unexpected outcome, the mismatch generates an automatic signal that recruits System 2 attention. Difficulty is another. When a problem cannot be resolved by pattern matching alone, the failure of the automatic system to generate a satisfactory output creates pressure for the more resource-intensive engagement of System 2. Stakes are a third. When the perceived consequences of error are sufficiently high, the motivation to invest
The cognitive resources required for System 2 engagement can override the default preference for cognitive ease. But each of these triggers has failure modes that are as consequential as the failures they are designed to prevent. Surprise only triggers System 2 if the violation of expectation is detected, and in domains where System 1's models are confidently wrong, the violations may not be detected precisely because the confidence of the model suppresses the uncertainty signals that would flag them. Difficulty only triggers System 2 if the problem's difficulty is recognized, and the WISITA feature of System 1 means that problems whose complexity exceeds what the available information can reveal may be experienced as easier than they actually are.
and stakes only trigger System 2 if the stakes are accurately perceived, which returns us to the fear and size instincts that distort risk perception in the systematic ways that factfulness documented. For the executive and the strategist, the operational implication of System 2's laziness is that the decisions most likely to be made with inadequate System 2 engagement are not the obviously complex decisions that generate explicit uncertainty and trigger deliberate analytical processes. They are the decisions that feel familiar enough for System 1 to generate a confident output. Decisions in domains where the professional has sufficient experience to produce fluent pattern recognition, but where that pattern recognition is being applied to a situation whose structural features differ from the historical cases that trained it in ways that are invisible to the automatic system. The experienced investor whose System 1 has been trained on historical market patterns that no longer characterize the current market environment. The seasoned negotiator whose System 1 has been calibrated on counterparty behaviors from a cultural or institutional context that differs from the one they are currently navigating. The veteran manager whose System 1 assessments of team member performance are being distorted by halo effects and availability biases that their experience has reinforced rather than corrected. In each of these cases, the very experience that generates System 1 confidence is the source of the systematic error, and the laziness of System 2 means that the confidence itself suppresses the uncertainty signals that would trigger the corrective engagement. Activating System 2 deliberately, consistently, and at the moments when its engagement is most consequential is not a matter of trying harder or being more careful in the colloquial sense. It is a matter of building structural interventions, environmental designs, decision protocols, and analytical practices that generate the triggers for System 2 engagement artificially in the absence of the natural triggers that System 1's confidence suppresses. In the next part, we examine the anchoring effect, the single most powerful,
most exploited cognitive bias produced by the System 1 architecture, and why the first number you hear in any negotiation is already determining your final position before the conversation has actually begun. There is a cognitive phenomenon so powerful, so reliably demonstrated across every population studied, so thoroughly exploited by every sophisticated negotiator, marketer, and influence practitioner who has ever understood it, and so completely invisible to the people it is operating on, that its consistent exclusion from standard professional training in negotiation, investment, and strategic decision-making must itself be counted as one of the most consequential gaps in the preparation of high-stakes professionals in the modern business environment. It does not require deception to deploy. It does not require the target to be unintelligent, inexperienced, or unattentive. It operates with equal force on Nobel laureates and on first-year analysts, on experienced judges sentencing criminal defendants, and on seasoned investors evaluating acquisition targets, on expert negotiators who know it exists, and on complete novices who have never encountered the concept. This is the anchoring effect, the automatic, irresistible, and almost entirely unconscious tendency of the human mind to use the first numerical value encountered in any judgment context as a gravitational reference point that pulls every subsequent numerical estimate toward it, regardless of the relevance, accuracy, or credibility of that initial value. The anchoring effect was among the first and most robust findings of Kahneman's foundational research with his longtime collaborator Amos Tversky, and its demonstration is both elegant and deeply unsettling in what it reveals about the relationship between System 1's automatic processing and the numerical judgments that System 2 believes it is making independently and analytically. In the original experimental paradigm, subjects were asked to estimate an unknown quantity, the percentage of African countries in the United Nations, for example, after first observing a number generated by an obviously random process, such as the spin of a wheel of fortune.
The random number had no informational content whatsoever about the quantity being estimated. Every subject knew it was random. Every subject understood that it bore no logical relationship to the correct answer. And yet, the estimates produced by subjects who saw a high random number were systematically, significantly, and reliably higher than the estimates produced by subjects who saw a low random number. Not by a small margin that might be attributed to noise, but by margins large enough to demonstrate that the random anchor was functioning as a genuine gravitational reference point for the subsequent estimates, pulling them toward it with a force that conscious knowledge of its irrelevance could not neutralize. The mechanism through which anchoring operates is rooted directly in the System 1 architecture that the previous sections have established. When a numerical anchor is presented, whether as a random number, an opening offer, or a suggested
retail price, a budget figure, or any other initial quantitative reference, System 1 immediately begins a process of associative activation that Kahneman describes as anchoring and adjustment. The anchor activates a network of associated information consistent with that numerical range, making information that supports values in the anchor's vicinity more cognitively accessible, and information that supports values far from the anchor less accessible. System 2, when it engages to evaluate the question, does not begin from a blank slate of pure analytical reasoning. It begins from an associative landscape that has already been shaped by the anchor, with information consistent with anchor proximate values preloaded and information consistent with anchor distant values relatively suppressed. The adjustment away from the anchor that System 2 performs is real. People do not simply adopt the anchor as their estimate, but it is systematically insufficient, stopping short of the true value because the adjustment process terminates as soon as a plausible value is reached, and the associative landscape shaped by the anchor makes plausibility assessments that are biased toward anchor proximate values. The professional implications of this mechanism are both immediate and structurally important across every domain where numerical judgments are made under conditions of uncertainty. In negotiation, the anchoring effect means that the party who sets the first number, whether an asking price, a compensation figure, a contract term, or a project budget, establishes the gravitational center around which the entire subsequent negotiation will orbit, regardless of how aggressively the other party attempts to move away from it. The counterintuitive implication, supported by extensive empirical research, is that extreme anchors, numbers far outside what either party would consider a reasonable final outcome, produce final agreements closer to the anchor than moderate opening positions do, because the extreme anchor shifts the associative landscape more dramatically, and the insufficient adjustment process leaves the final position more strongly influenced by the starting point. The negotiator who opens with an extreme anchor and then makes visible, seemingly generous concessions toward a position that still reflects the anchor's gravitational influence is deploying one of the most empirically validated influence techniques in the behavioral science literature, and they are deploying it against a counterpart whose System 1 is processing the anchor's influence below the threshold of conscious awareness. In investment and financial analysis, the anchoring effect produces systematic distortions in valuation that are among the most thoroughly documented phenomena in behavioral finance. Analysts anchored to a stock's 52-week high will produce price targets that cluster around that anchor, even when fundamental analysis clearly supports values far from it. Acquisition negotiators, anchored to the seller's initial asking price, will produce final offers that reflect the anchor's influence even after extensive due diligence has produced information that, in the absence of the anchor, would have generated dramatically different valuations. Budget holders anchored to prior year spending levels will produce proposals that cluster around the historical baseline, even when strategic analysis supports radical reallocation.
In each case, the anchor is not functioning as a piece of information being analytically evaluated. It is functioning as a cognitive environment within which all subsequent analytical processes are conducted, shaping their outputs through the associative activation mechanism that System 1 deploys automatically and that System 2's lazy, resource-conserving engagement style is structurally ill-equipped to override. The antidote to anchoring is not awareness alone. The research is unambiguous on this point, and the unambiguousness is important because awareness is the first and most natural response that professionals have when they learn about the anchoring effect. Knowing that anchoring exists does not neutralize its operation. Judges who were explicitly warned about the anchoring effect before being asked to make sentencing decisions that had been experimentally anchored showed anchor influence that was statistically indistinguishable from judges who received no warning. The antidote requires structural intervention, the deliberate generation of counter-anchors before exposure to the primary anchor, the mandatory completion of independent valuation analysis before any external anchor is encountered, and the construction of decision protocols that require explicit justification for any estimate that falls within the gravitational range of a known anchor. The first number in any conversation is not the beginning of the negotiation. It is the architecture within which the negotiation will be conducted, and the professional who does not set it is living inside a cognitive structure built by someone else. In the next part, we examine the availability heuristic, the systematic tendency to judge probability by ease of recall rather than by actual frequency, and why the most memorable events in your professional history are systematically distorting every risk assessment you make today. There is a question that every professional who has ever made a risk assessment, constructed a probability estimate, or evaluated the likelihood of a future outcome has answered, and answered with a confidence that bore no reliable relationship to the accuracy of the answer produced. The question is not asked explicitly. It is not part of any formal analytical protocol. It is asked automatically, instantaneously, and entirely below the threshold of conscious awareness by a System 1 architecture that has substituted it for the genuinely difficult probabilistic question it was supposed to answer. The question System 1 actually asks, in place of what is the actual probability of this outcome, is how easily can I recall an example of this outcome occurring? And the answer to that question, delivered as a direct perception of probability rather than as the result of a memory retrieval process, shapes every risk assessment, every investment decision, every strategic planning assumption, and every judgment about the future that you have ever made in your professional life. This is the availability heuristic, and its systematic distortion of probability judgment is so pervasive, so consistent across populations and professional domains, and so resistant to correction through expertise and experience alone that understanding it is not merely useful for anyone operating in high-stakes environments. It is the prerequisite for any honest accounting of the actual reliability of their own judgment under uncertainty. The availability heuristic was identified by Kahneman and Tversky in their foundational paper 1973 as one of the primary cognitive shortcuts through which System 1 replaces genuinely difficult probability assessments with intuitively accessible but systematically biased substitutes. The mechanism is straightforward in its description and devastating in its implications. When asked to assess the probability of an event, the likelihood that a specific type of investment will fail, the probability that a particular competitive threat will materialize, the risk that a project will exceed its timeline and budget, System 1 does not access a stored statistical database of relevant base rates and compute a probability from that data. It searches its associative network for examples of the event in question and uses the fluency and ease of that retrieval, how quickly examples come to mind, how many examples are accessible, how vivid and emotionally resonant those examples are, as a direct proxy for the event's probability. High retrieval fluency produces high probability estimates. Low retrieval fluency produces low probability estimates. And retrieval fluency is determined not by the actual frequency of the event in the world, but by a completely different set of factors: recency, emotional intensity, personal relevance, media exposure, and narrative salience that have no necessary relationship to actual base rates. The professional consequences of this substitution are both immediate and structurally significant across every domain where probability judgment matters. In risk assessment, the availability heuristic produces systematic overestimation of the probabilities of dramatic, memorable, emotionally resonant events, plane crashes, terrorist attacks, product liability disasters, high-profile corporate failures, and systematic underestimation of the probabilities of mundane, statistically frequent but cognitively unexciting events, gradual market share erosion, slow-moving operational inefficiencies, incremental regulatory tightening, the compound effects of talent attrition. The dramatic events are available. They generate vivid, memorable experiences.
Memories, they receive extensive media coverage. They activate strong emotional responses that enhance their memorability, and their availability inflates their perceived probability far beyond what the actual base rates support. The mundane events are unavailable. They leave no vivid memory traces. They receive no media attention. They generate no emotional response that would make them salient in the associative network. And their unavailability deflates their perceived probability far below what the actual base rates support. In investment decision-making, the availability heuristic produces the performance-chasing phenomenon that behavioral finance researchers have documented with extraordinary consistency across markets, time periods, and investor sophistication levels. Recent strong performance in an asset class or investment strategy makes examples of that performance highly available in the memories of investors evaluating it, and the availability of those examples inflates the probability estimate for future strong performance beyond what the statistical base rates actually support. Recent poor performance makes examples of loss and underperformance highly available, and their availability deflates probability estimates for future recovery below what historical mean reversion data would predict. The result is a systematic pattern of buying high and selling low that is not, at its root, a failure of analytical capability or market knowledge. It is a direct expression of the availability heuristic operating on the most recently available performance data and generating probability estimates that are systematically biased toward continuation of recent trends, regardless of what the longer-term base rates indicate. In competitive strategy, the availability heuristic shapes the threat landscape that executives perceive and respond to in ways that systematically misallocate defensive resources. The competitive threat that received extensive media coverage in the past 12 months is highly available, and its availability inflates its perceived probability of materializing into a serious competitive challenge. The competitive threat that has been developing quietly without media coverage or industry conference discussion is unavailable, and its unavailability suppresses its perceived probability to near zero, regardless of what a careful analysis of underlying structural trends would reveal about its actual likelihood. Organizations whose strategic planning processes are driven primarily by threat perceptions of senior executives operating on unexamined availability heuristics will consistently over-respond to salient but improbable threats and under-respond to unsalient but highly probable ones, a pattern of resource misallocation that compounds across every strategic planning cycle it is allowed to operate uncorrected. Kahneman's antidote for the availability heuristic requires a fundamental restructuring of the relationship between memory-based intuition and statistical base rates in the probability assessment process. The discipline begins with the
Explicit identification and application of relevant base rates before any intuitive probability estimate is formed, a sequencing requirement that directly counters the availability heuristics mechanism by ensuring that the statistical anchor for the probability assessment is established before the availability of memorable examples can distort it. This requires institutional commitment to base rate research as a standard component of every significant risk assessment process, and structural protocols that prevent the communication of intuitive probability estimates before base rate data has been reviewed and explicitly incorporated. What you remember most vividly is not what happens most often, and building your risk architecture on the foundation of your most vivid memories is not risk management. It is the systematic institutionalization of your most emotionally resonant past surprises as the primary determinants of your future strategic posture. In the next part, we dissect the halo effect and the representativeness heuristic, the twin mechanisms through which System 1 constructs complete judgments from incomplete evidence and delivers them with the confidence that the evidence could never actually support. There is a judgment process occurring in your mind every time you encounter a new person, evaluate a new business proposal, assess a new investment opportunity, or form an opinion about an organization you have limited direct experience with. A process that feels like careful, balanced, multidimensional evaluation and is, in the overwhelming majority of cases, nothing of the sort. It is a process in which System 1 extracts one or two salient, emotionally resonant features from the available information, constructs a global judgment from those fragments, and then delivers that judgment to consciousness as if it were the product of a comprehensive analytical assessment of all relevant dimensions simultaneously. The confidence with which this judgment is held is not proportional to the completeness of the information it was built from. It is proportional to the internal coherence of the narrative that System 1 has constructed from the fragments, and internal coherence, as the YSITI principle established, is a property of the narrative, not of the underlying reality the narrative claims to represent. This is the halo effect, one of the most pervasive, most consequential, and most thoroughly documented cognitive biases in the psychological literature, and understanding its mechanism is not merely an exercise in self-awareness, it is a forensic examination of the actual
process by which the most consequential professional judgments in your life are being formed. The halo effect was first systematically documented by the psychologist Edward Thorndike in 1920, who observed that military officers rating their subordinates on multiple independent dimensions — intelligence, physical appearance, leadership ability, personal qualities — produced ratings that were far more highly correlated across dimensions than the actual independence of those dimensions could justify. Officers rated as highly physically impressive were rated as more intelligent, more capable leaders, and better people, not because physical impressiveness is causally related to these other dimensions, but because a positive impression on one dimension automatically activated positive associations across all connected dimensions in the evaluator's associative network. Kahneman extended this foundational observation into a comprehensive account of how System 1 uses global affective responses, the immediate, automatic, pre-analytical emotional reaction to a person, object, or idea, as a master variable that shapes all subsequent dimension-specific evaluations, producing the appearance of multidimensional assessment while actually delivering a series of variations on a single global theme established in the first moments of contact. The operational mechanism of the halo effect in professional contexts is both simple and extraordinarily resistant to correction through deliberate effort alone. When a candidate walks into an interview and makes a strong first impression through physical presentation, vocal confidence, social fluency, or any other dimension that activates positive affect in System 1, that initial positive affect immediately shapes all subsequent evaluations.
Questions that would generate ambiguous answers from a neutral evaluative baseline are interpreted charitably. Weaknesses that would be weighted heavily against a candidate who had generated neutral or negative initial affect are minimized or reframed as acceptable trade-offs. Strengths are weighted more heavily than they would be in the absence of the initial positive affect. And the final evaluation, delivered by System 2 as the product of careful, multidimensional analysis, is, in its deep structure, an elaboration of the initial affective response that System 1 generated before the interview had meaningfully begun. The reverse operates with equal force. A candidate who generates negative initial affect will have their strengths minimized, their weaknesses amplified, and their ambiguous responses interpreted uncharitably, in a process that feels like balanced evaluation and is driven by the same affective halo operating in the negative direction. The representativeness heuristic operates through a related but distinct mechanism, the automatic System 1 tendency to judge the probability that something belongs to a category by assessing how closely it resembles the prototype of that category.
Category, rather than by applying the statistical base rates that would actually determine that probability in any rigorously analytical framework. Kahneman's most famous illustration of this heuristic is the character of Linda, described as a 31-year-old woman who is single, outspoken, and very bright, who majored in philosophy, was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice as a student, and participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Subjects are then asked whether it is more probable that Linda is a bank teller or that Linda is a bank teller who was active in the feminist movement. The overwhelming majority of subjects, including statistically sophisticated graduate students, judge the second option as more probable than the first, despite the fact that this judgment violates the most elementary principle of probability theory, which states that the probability of two events occurring together can never exceed the probability of either event occurring alone. The conjunction fallacy, as Kahneman calls it, occurs because Linda's description so closely resembles the prototype of a feminist activist that System 1's representativeness assessment overwhelms System 2's capacity to apply the simple logical constraint that should make the correct answer obvious. In investment and business evaluation contexts, the representativeness heuristic produces a systematic pattern of errors that Kahneman identifies as the narrative fallacy, the tendency to judge the quality of a business, an investment, or a strategic initiative by how closely its story resembles the prototype of a successful business, investment, or strategic initiative, rather than by the actual statistical base rates of success in the relevant category. A startup whose founder has the biographical profile of a successful entrepreneur, elite educational credentials, prior startup experience, compelling personal narrative, confident, articulate communication style, will be evaluated as significantly more likely to succeed than the base rates for startup success in its category actually support, because its story activates the representativeness heuristic strongly, and System 2 fails to apply the corrective base rate information that would calibrate the probability estimate downward toward the category mean. The antidote for both the halo effect and the representativeness heuristic requires the same structural intervention, the deliberate sequencing of independent, dimension-specific evaluations before any global assessment is formed, combined with the mandatory application of relevant base rate data before any representativeness-based probability estimate is accepted as analytically valid. The first intervention directly counters the halo effect by preventing the global affective response from contaminating dimension-specific evaluations before those evaluations have been independently formed. The second counters the representativeness heuristic by anchoring probability estimates in statistical reality before the prototype matching process can inflate them beyond what the base rates support. The verdict System 1 delivers feels like justice. It is almost always a story.
In the next part, we confront the planning fallacy and overconfidence bias, the twin cognitive distortions that guarantee every significant project you undertake will cost more, take longer, and deliver less than you projected, and why expertise makes this worse, not better. Part 7, The Planning Fallacy and Overconfidence, Why Every Project You've Ever Run Was Wrong Before It Started. There is a phenomenon so universal, so consistently documented across every category of human planning project, and so completely resistant to correction through experience, expertise, or explicit awareness, that its persistence in the planning processes of the most sophisticated organizations in the world must be understood not as a correctable oversight, but as a structural feature of the cognitive architecture that produces all planning, a feature that will continue generating the same predictable pattern of cost overruns, timeline extensions, and benefit shortfalls for as long as the human brain remains the primary instrument of strategic forecasting. The phenomenon is the planning fallacy, Kahneman's term for the systematic tendency of individuals and organizations to construct planning projects that are unrealistically optimistic about costs, timelines, and outcomes, not because they lack relevant information about the difficulty of similar projects, not because they are deliberately misrepresenting their expectations, but because the cognitive architecture of planning is structurally biased toward the best-case scenario in ways that no amount of deliberate effort to be realistic can fully overcome without a fundamental change in the process by which plans are constructed and evaluated. The planning fallacy emerges directly from the interaction between System 1's WYASTI feature and the specific cognitive task that planning requires. When constructing a plan for a future project, the mind's default process is to simulate the execution of that plan, to mentally walk through the sequence of steps from initiation to completion, identifying the resources required at each stage, estimating the time each step will take, and summing these estimates into a total projection. This inside view planning process, as Kahneman calls it, is dominated by System 1's associative simulation of the specific plan being evaluated, and that simulation is systematically biased towards smooth, uninterrupted execution, in which each step proceeds as designed. Resources are available when needed, dependencies resolve on schedule, and the inevitable unforeseen complications that characterize the actual execution of every complex project simply do not appear because they are by definition unforeseen and therefore absent from the simulation. The inside view in investment and business evaluation contexts, the representativeness heuristic, produces a systematic pattern of errors that Kahneman identifies as the narrative fallacy, the tendency to judge the quality of a business, an investment, or a strategic initiative by how closely its story resembles the prototype of a successful business, investment, or strategic initiative, rather than by the actual statistical base rates of success in the relevant category. A startup whose founder has the biographical profile of a successful entrepreneur, elite educational credentials, prior startup experience, compelling personal narrative, confident, articulate communication style, will be evaluated as significantly more likely to succeed than the base rates for startup success in its category actually support, because its story activates the representativeness heuristic strongly, and System 2 fails to apply the corrective base rate information that would calibrate the probability estimate downward toward the category mean. The antidote for both the halo effect and the representativeness heuristic requires the same structural intervention, the deliberate sequencing of independent dimension-specific evaluations before any global assessment is formed, combined with the mandatory application of relevant base rate data before any representativeness-based probability estimate is accepted as analytically valid. The first intervention directly counters the halo effect by preventing the global affective response from contaminating dimension-specific evaluations before those evaluations have been independently formed. The second counters the representativeness heuristic by anchoring probability estimates in statistical reality before the prototype matching process can inflate them beyond what the base rates support.
Plan is not a description of what will probably happen. It is a description of what will happen if everything goes right, and everything never goes right. The antidote to the inside view is what Kahneman, building on the work of his colleague Bent Flyberg, calls reference class forecasting, the deliberate adoption of an outside view that grounds project projections in the statistical base rates of similar projects rather than in the simulation of the specific project being planned. The outside view asks not how long will our project take given our specific plan and our specific team and our specific resources, but how long do projects like this actually take across the full population of comparable projects that have been attempted and completed or failed. The answer to this question, derived from empirical data on the reference class of comparable projects rather than from the simulation of the specific instance, consistently and dramatically exceeds the inside view projection, not because the specific project is necessarily worse than average, but because the inside view simulation systematically excludes the complications, delays, and resource constraints that the reference class data captures as statistical regularities of the project type. The empirical record of the planning fallacy is both extensive and sobering. Large infrastructure projects, bridges, tunnels, rail lines, public buildings, systematically exceed their projected costs by margins that average between 50 and 100% across thousands of projects studied in dozens of countries over multiple decades. Software development projects consistently take 2 to 3 times longer than projected and deliver a fraction of the planned functionality within the original timeline. Corporate mergers and acquisitions consistently fail to deliver the projected synergies that justified their valuation premiums, not occasionally, not in particularly difficult market environments, but as a statistical regularity that has been documented with sufficient consistency to constitute one of the most robust findings in the strategic management literature. In each of these domains, the professionals doing the planning are not naive. They are experienced. They have seen projects go wrong before. They know, in the abstract, that projects are often harder than expected, and they continue to produce optimistic projections with a reliability that demonstrates clearly that abstract knowledge of the planning fallacy is insufficient to correct its operation in any specific planning instance. This resistance to correction through experience leads directly to the second major cognitive distortion of this section, overconfidence bias, which Kahneman identifies as the single most consequential cognitive bias in the domain of judgment and decision-making, and which provides the motivational fuel that keeps the planning fallacy operating despite decades of accumulated evidence of its costs. Overconfidence is not merely the tendency to be too confident in specific judgments. It is a pervasive, multidimensional feature of human cognition that manifests in At least 3 distinct forms, each with its own operational consequences and its own specific pattern of professional damage. The first form is over-precision, the tendency to hold probability distributions over uncertain outcomes that are too narrow, assigning too little probability to outcomes outside a central range that feels intuitively plausible. The second is overplacement, the well-documented tendency of individuals to rate their own performance, judgment, and capabilities as above average relative to their peers, a statistical impossibility that nonetheless characterizes the self-assessments of the overwhelming majority of people in virtually every domain studied. The third is overestimation, the tendency to overestimate one's own absolute performance, the quality of one's own judgment, and the accuracy of one's own predictions relative to what objective measurement of those predictions reveals.
The interaction between the planning fallacy and overconfidence creates a compounding distortion that is particularly damaging in entrepreneurial and strategic contexts. The entrepreneur who is planning a new venture brings to that planning process both an inside view simulation that excludes unforeseen complications and an overconfident assessment of their capabilities, their team's execution quality, their market timing, and their competitive positioning. The result is a projection that is optimistic from both directions simultaneously, optimistic about the difficulty of the task and optimistic about the capability of the team attempting it. The venture capital industry has documented the consequences of this compounding with uncomfortable precision. The majority of funded ventures fail to achieve their projected milestones, and the majority of those failures can be traced, in retrospect, to projections that reflected the inside view planning fallacy combined with overconfident capability assessment rather than the reference class base rates that a more calibrated analytical process would have produced. Your plan is not a prediction. It is a best-case scenario dressed in the clothing of an expectation.
In the next part, we examine prospect theory and loss aversion, Kahneman's Nobel Prize-winning insight into why losses hurt twice as much as equivalent gains feel good, and why this asymmetry is silently governing every financial and strategic decision you make. There is a discovery at the center of Kahneman's life work that is so fundamental to the actual mechanics of human decision-making under conditions of risk and uncertainty that it permanently invalidated the foundational assumption of classical economic theory, the assumption that rational agents evaluate outcomes in terms of their absolute utility, weigh probabilities accurately, and select the option that maximizes expected value across the full range of possible outcomes. This discovery did not emerge from philosophical argument or theoretical critique. It emerged from empirical observation, from the systematic documentation of actual human choices in carefully designed experimental contexts that revealed with a precision and a replicability that the economic establishment could not dismiss, that human beings do not behave like the rational agents that economic theory assumed, that the deviations from rational behavior are not random noise distributed evenly around the rational ideal, and that those deviations are instead systematic, predictable, and driven by a set of psychological principles whose structure Kahneman and Tversky captured in what they called prospect theory, the theoretical framework that earned Kahneman the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2002, and that remains the most empirically validated descriptive model of human decision-making under risk ever constructed. The foundational insight of prospect theory is deceptively simple in its statement and profound in its implications. Human beings do not evaluate outcomes in terms of their absolute levels of wealth or utility. They evaluate them in terms of changes from a reference point, gains and losses relative to a baseline that is typically defined by the current state, the expected state, or a recently experienced state. This reference dependence means that the same objective outcome can be experienced as a gain or a loss depending entirely on the reference point from which it is evaluated, and that the psychological experience of a gain and the psychological experience of an equivalent loss are not mirror images of each other. They are asymmetric in a way that Kahneman and Tversky's empirical research quantified with remarkable precision. Losses are experienced as approximately twice as psychologically powerful as equivalent gains. The pain of losing $100 is not equal to the pleasure of gaining $100. It is approximately equal to the pleasure of gaining $200. This asymmetry, loss aversion, is not a cultural artifact, not a product of specific socioeconomic conditions, and not a correctable misunderstanding of probability. It is a fundamental feature of the human value function that has been replicated across cultures, income levels, age groups, and levels of financial sophistication, with a consistency that establishes it as one of the most robust findings in the behavioral science literature.
The value function that prospect theory describes has three properties that together define the psychological landscape within which all decisions under risk are actually made. The first is reference dependence, the evaluation of outcomes as gains or losses relative to a reference point, rather than as absolute levels of wealth. The second is diminishing sensitivity, the property that the psychological impact of additional gains or losses decreases as the distance from the reference point increases, producing a value function that is concave in the domain of gains and convex in the domain of losses. The third is loss aversion, the asymmetry between the steepness of the value function in the loss domain and its steepness in the gain domain, with the loss side approximately twice as steep as the gain side at equivalent distances from the reference point. These three properties interact to produce a specific pattern of risk preferences that departs systematically from the predictions of expected utility theory. Risk aversion in the domain of gains, where people prefer a certain smaller gain to a probabilistic larger one, in a pattern of preference reversal that classical theory cannot accommodate, but that prospect theory predicts with mathematical precision. The operational consequences of loss aversion in professional decision-making contexts are both pervasive and severe. In investment management, loss aversion produces the disposition effect, the well-documented tendency of investors to sell winning positions too early, to lock in the certain gain before it can be lost, and to hold losing positions too long, avoiding the certain realization of a loss in the hope that the position will recover. This pattern is directly predicted by the prospect theory value function. The concavity of the value function in the gain domain makes the certain gain of selling a winner more attractive than the probabilistic larger gain of holding it, while the convexity in the loss domain makes the probabilistic recovery of a loser more attractive than the certain smaller loss of selling it. The result is a systematic pattern of portfolio management that sells the best positions and holds the worst ones, an inversion of the rational strategy that compounds its damage across every investment cycle it is allowed to operate uncorrected. In negotiation, loss aversion shapes the reference point dynamics that determine how offers and counteroffers are evaluated in ways that sophisticated negotiators
have learned to exploit with considerable precision. The frame through which an outcome is presented as a gain relative to a pessimistic baseline or as a loss relative to an optimistic one determines how that outcome is psychologically experienced and therefore how much resistance it generates, independently of its objective content. An outcome that represents a gain of $50,000 relative to the worst-case scenario and a loss of $50,000 relative to the best-case scenario is the same outcome in every objective sense, but it will be accepted far more readily when framed as a gain and resisted far more strongly when framed as a loss, because the loss aversion asymmetry means that the pain of a perceived loss is twice as motivating as the pleasure of an equivalent perceived gain. The negotiator who controls the reference point controls the psychological landscape of every decision that follows. In the next part, we examine the conflict between the narrative mind and the statistical mind, why the story always defeats the data in the court of System 1 judgment, and what this means for every evidence-based argument you have ever tried to make. There is a fundamental incompatibility at the heart of evidence-based professional communication that no amount of analytical sophistication, no quality of data, no rigor of statistical methodology can resolve through the conventional approaches that technical training produces, an incompatibility between the format in which the most reliable knowledge about the world is expressed and the format in which the human mind is architecturally designed to receive, process, retain, and act on information. The most reliable knowledge is expressed in statistical form, in base rates, probability distributions, regression analyses, and meta-analytic summaries that aggregate the signal from large samples and correct for the noise of individual cases. The human mind is designed to receive information in narrative form, in stories about specific individuals, concrete events, vivid sensory details, emotional stakes, and causal sequences that unfold through time with a beginning, a middle, and an end.
These two formats are not merely different presentations of equivalent content. They activate different cognitive systems, engage different neural architectures, produce different patterns of retention and recall, and generate different levels of motivational force in the decisions they influence. And in the competition between them for the authority to shape human judgment, the narrative wins with a consistency and a margin that the statistical evidence, delivered in statistical format, is almost entirely powerless to challenge. Kahneman's documentation of this competition between narrative and statistical cognition runs throughout Thinking Fast and Slow as one of its most practically consequential themes. Practically consequential because it explains a pattern of professional failure that is among the most frustrating and most poorly understood in every domain where evidence is supposed to drive decisions. The pattern is this: a professional presents carefully assembled statistical evidence that clearly supports a specific conclusion. The audience acknowledges the evidence intellectually and then makes a decision that is driven primarily by a vivid anecdotal case that contradicts the statistical conclusion. The professional attributes this outcome to irrationality, to politics, to motivated reasoning, or to some other failure of the decision-making process. Kahneman's analysis reveals that it is none of these things. It is the predictable output of a cognitive architecture in which statistical evidence and narrative evidence do not compete on equal terms, in which the narrative activates System 1's associative machinery with an immediacy and an emotional force that statistical evidence simply cannot replicate, and in which System 2's capacity to override System 1's narrative-driven conclusion requires a level of deliberate, sustained, effortful engagement that the cognitive laziness of System 2 make unavailable in all but the most specifically structured decision environments. The mechanism through which narrative dominates statistical cognition operates at the level of what Kahneman calls the representativeness heuristic, the System 1 tendency to judge by similarity to a prototype rather than by statistical base rates. A vivid story about a specific individual or case activates System 1's prototype matching machinery with enormous force because the specific details of the story, the names, the faces, the emotional stakes, the causal sequence, are precisely the kind of information that the associative network was built to process and retain. Statistical data, by contrast, provides no specific individuals to match against prototypes, no emotional stakes to activate the affect heuristic, no causal sequence to engage the narrative simulation machinery. It provides numbers, and numbers, stripped of the associative context that would make them emotionally resonant, process through System 2's analytical machinery rather than System 1's associative one, with all the cognitive effort, motivational resistance, and retention degradation that System 2 engagement entails. The practical implication for anyone who needs to communicate evidence in ways that actually change decisions, executives presenting strategic analyses to boards, consultants presenting recommendations to clients, researchers presenting findings to policymakers, managers presenting performance data to teams, is that the conventional approach of leading with the statistical evidence and supporting it with illustrative examples inverts the actual cognitive sequence through which the audience will process and retain the information. The statistical evidence, presented first, will be processed analytically by System 2, retained poorly, and integrated weakly into the subsequent decision. The illustrative example, presented second, as a subordinate supporting element, will be processed automatically by System 1, retained powerfully, and integrated strongly into the subsequent decision, often to the point of overriding the statistical conclusion that the example was supposed to illustrate. The inversion of this sequence, leading with the narrative and using it to create the associative context within which the statistical evidence will subsequently be processed, is not a rhetorical trick or a manipulation of irrational audiences.
It is an accurate application of the actual cognitive sequence through which human beings process and integrate information from different formats. The narrative creates the emotional and associative priming that makes the subsequent statistical data cognitively accessible, that gives the numbers a human context, a causal sequence, and an emotional stake that allows System 1 to process them with the engagement and retention that System 2 alone cannot provide. This sequencing does not make the statistical evidence more persuasive by making it less rigorous. It makes it more persuasive by making it more cognitively accessible, by delivering it through a channel that the human mind was built to receive, rather than one that it was not. The second implication is for the construction of the narrative itself, specifically for the selection of the individual case or story that will serve as the primary vehicle through which statistical insights are communicated. The effectiveness of narrative in activating System 1's processing machinery is directly proportional to the specificity, vividness, emotional resonance, and causal clarity of the story, and inversely proportional to its abstractness, its generality, and its emotional neutrality. A story about a specific named individual whose specific decisions led to specific measurable consequences activates the associative machinery with far greater force than a story about a generic representative type whose general behaviors led to general outcomes. The professional who invests in the construction of maximally specific, maximally vivid narratives for communicating statistical insights is not compromising the integrity of the evidence. They are optimizing the cognitive channel through which that evidence will actually influence the decisions it is intended to inform. The data knows the truth. The story decides what gets believed. The professional who cannot build the story that carries the data will always lose to the professional who can, regardless of whose data is more accurate. In the next part, we examine confirmation bias and selective memory, the mechanisms through which System 1 actively recruits evidence for conclusions it has already reached, and why the mind you trust to evaluate evidence is the same mind that is systematically corrupting it. There is a process occurring in your cognitive architecture right now, as you read these words, as you evaluate these arguments, as you decide whether the framework being presented is accurate, useful, and worthy of integration into your professional practice. That is simultaneously the most important process for genuine intellectual development and the most reliably corrupted process in the entire repertoire of human cognition. It is the process of evidence evaluation, the process by which new information is assessed against existing beliefs, existing mental models, and existing conclusions to determine whether it confirms, challenges, or requires the revision of what you currently hold to be true. In the idealized model of rational cognition that both classical economics and common sense assume, this process is symmetrical. Confirming evidence and disconfirming evidence are weighted equally, assessed by the same standards, and integrated with the same thoroughness into an ongoing revision of beliefs toward greater accuracy. In the actual cognitive architecture that Kahneman's research documents, the process is profoundly asymmetrical. Confirming evidence is accepted with minimal scrutiny, integrated rapidly, and retained durably, while disconfirming evidence is subjected to intensive critical examination, integrated reluctantly, if at all, and retained poorly even when it successfully passes the heightened scrutiny threshold. This asymmetry is confirmation bias, and it is not a correctable quirk of undisciplined thinking. Specificity, vividness, emotional resonance, and causal clarity of the story, and inversely proportional to its abstractness, its generality, and its emotional neutrality. A story about a specific named individual whose specific decisions led to specific measurable consequences activates the associative machinery with far greater force than a story about a generic representative type whose general behaviors led to general outcomes. The professional who invests in the construction of maximally specific, maximally vivid narratives for communicating statistical insights is not compromising the integrity of the evidence.
They are optimizing the cognitive channel through which that evidence will actually influence the decisions it is intended to inform. The data knows the truth. The story decides what gets believed. The professional who cannot build the story that carries the data will always lose to the professional who can, regardless of whose data is more accurate. In the next part, we examine confirmation bias and selective memory, the mechanisms through which System 1 actively recruits evidence for conclusions it has already reached, and why the mind you trust to evaluate evidence is the same mind that is systematically corrupting it. There is a process occurring in your cognitive architecture right now, as you read these words, as you evaluate these arguments, as you decide whether the framework being presented is accurate, useful, and worthy of integration into your professional practice, that is simultaneously the most important process for genuine intellectual development and the most reliably corrupted process in the entire repertoire of human cognition. It is the process of evidence evaluation, the process by which new information is assessed against existing beliefs, existing mental models, and existing conclusions to determine whether it confirms, challenges, or requires the revision of what you currently hold to be true. In the idealized model of rational cognition that both classical economics and common sense assume, this process is symmetrical. Confirming evidence and disconfirming evidence are weighted equally, assessed by the same standards, and integrated with the same thoroughness into an ongoing revision of beliefs toward greater accuracy. In the actual cognitive architecture that Kahneman's research documents, the process is profoundly asymmetrical. Confirming evidence is accepted with minimal scrutiny, integrated rapidly, and retained durably, while disconfirming evidence is subjected to intensive critical examination, integrated reluctantly, if at all, and retained poorly even when it successfully passes the heightened scrutiny threshold. This asymmetry is confirmation bias, and it is not a correctable quirk of undisciplined thinking. It is the fundamental condition of human cognition.
A structural feature of the System 1 architecture that shapes the evidence evaluation process before System 2's analytical engagement begins. The mechanism of confirmation bias operates through the same associative network activation that underlies every other System 1 process examined in this framework. When a piece of information is encountered that is consistent with an existing belief, that activates associative networks already primed by that belief and fits smoothly into the narrative structure that the belief supports. System 1 processes it with cognitive ease, generates a positive affect response, and delivers it to System 2 with an implicit endorsement that reduces the threshold for analytical acceptance. When a piece of information is encountered that is inconsistent with an existing belief, that fails to activate the expected associative networks, creates cognitive friction, and disrupts the narrative coherence that the belief provides, System 1 processes it with cognitive difficulty, generates a negative affect response, and delivers it to System 2 with an implicit challenge that raises the threshold for analytical acceptance. The result is a systematic double standard in evidence evaluation that is not experienced as a double standard. It is experienced as appropriate rigor applied to uncertain claims, as healthy skepticism towards surprising findings, as the reasonable demand for higher standards of proof for conclusions that contradict established knowledge. It feels like intellectual integrity. It is its systematic negation. The professional consequences of confirmation bias compound across every domain where belief revision in response to disconfirming evidence is a prerequisite for accurate judgment. In strategic planning, the executive who has committed to a strategic direction will process incoming market data through a confirmation bias filter that makes evidence consistent with the strategy's success more cognitively accessible and more readily integrated into the ongoing assessment, while evidence of the strategy's failure requires higher thresholds of magnitude and clarity before it triggers genuine reconsideration.
The result is a systematic lag between the actual deterioration of a strategy's viability and the leadership recognition of that deterioration, a lag that compounds with each planning cycle, and that the organizational dynamics of hierarchical accountability further extend because the people closest to the disconfirming evidence are the people with the greatest incentives to filter it before it reaches the decision-making level, where it could trigger the strategic revision they know is needed. In financial markets, confirmation bias produces the phenomenon that behavioral finance researchers have documented as belief perseverance, the tendency of investors to maintain their investment theses in the face of accumulating contradictory evidence, processing each piece of disconfirming data through an increasingly elaborate set of alternative explanations that preserve the original thesis,
while accommodating the new evidence at the margins. The investor who has constructed a bullish thesis about a specific company will interpret disappointing earnings as a temporary setback, interpret management guidance revisions as conservative sandbagging, interpret competitor gains as cyclical fluctuations, and interpret analyst downgrades as evidence of the market's failure to understand the long-term opportunity, all while the stock price declines and the disconfirming evidence accumulates to levels that an unbiased observer would find overwhelming. This is not stubbornness in the colloquial sense. It is confirmation bias operating with mechanical reliability on an associative network that has been built around the original thesis and that processes all subsequent information through the filter that thesis has created. Selective memory, the companion process to confirmation bias, operates through the retrieval side of the same asymmetry. Not only does the mind preferentially accept confirming evidence at the input stage, it preferentially retains and retrieves it at the output stage, producing a remembered history of one's own judgments, predictions, and decisions that is systematically more accurate and more consistent than the actual record would support. Kahneman documents this through the hindsight bias, the retrospective distortion of one's prior beliefs toward alignment with outcomes that were not actually predicted, producing the subjective experience of having known it all along. The professional who remembers their predictions as more accurate than they were, who recalls their decisions as more informed than they were, and who reconstructs their prior beliefs as more consistent with subsequent outcomes than they actually were, is not being dishonest. They are experiencing the output of a memory system that encodes, retains, and retrieves information through the same confirmation bias filter that shapes initial evidence evaluation, producing a personal history that is systematically more flattering and more coherent than the actual record would support. The antidote requires structural intervention at both the input and output stages of the evidence evaluation process. At the input stage, the discipline of actively seeking disconfirming evidence, of deliberately constructing and pursuing the strongest possible case against one's current beliefs before accepting those beliefs as sufficiently validated, directly counters the asymmetric scrutiny that confirmation bias applies to confirming and disconfirming evidence. At the output stage, the practice of maintaining explicit written records of predictions, beliefs, and the reasoning behind decisions before outcomes are known provides an objective baseline against which the hindsight bias can be detected and corrected, replacing the selectively remembered history that confirmation bias produces with an accurate record that genuine learning requires.
The mind that evaluates evidence is the same mind that has already decided what it wants to find, and it is extraordinarily good at finding exactly that. In the next part, we examine the two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self, and why the self that makes your decisions has never actually lived a single moment of your life.
There is a distinction at the heart of Kahneman's later work that's perhaps the most philosophically unsettling of all the insights in Thinking Fast and Slow. Unsettling not merely because it challenges a professional assumption or a cognitive habit, but because it challenges something far more fundamental: the assumption that the self who evaluates your life, who decides whether your choices have been good ones, who determines what you want in the future based on what you have valued in the past, is the same self who actually lived the experiences that form the basis of those evaluations. Kahneman's research reveals that it is not, that there are, in the functional sense that matters for decision-making, two distinct selves operating within every human being: the experiencing self, which lives in the present moment, registering the actual hedonic quality of experience as it unfolds second by second through time, and the remembering self, which constructs and maintains the narrative of a life, evaluates past experiences as episodes with overall qualities, and makes decisions about the future based on those evaluations. These two selves do not merely have different perspectives on the same reality. They operate by different rules, weight evidence differently, and systematically disagree about the value of experiences in ways that produce some of the most consequential and most poorly understood decision errors in human life. The experiencing self lives in what psychologists call the psychological present, the approximately 3-second window of conscious awareness within which sensory experience is directly registered as occurring now rather than as a memory of something that occurred. Within this window, the experiencing self registers the actual hedonic quality of experience with considerable accuracy: the intensity of pleasure or pain, the quality of engagement or boredom, the presence or absence of positive affect. But the experiencing self has no narrative capacity. It does not construct stories about experiences, does not evaluate episodes as wholes, and does not maintain a cumulative account of past experiences that can be consulted when making decisions about future ones. It exists entirely in the present moment, with no access to the past it has lived, and no influence over the future decisions that will determine what it experiences next. Its testimony about the quality of life as it is actually lived is the most accurate available, and it is almost entirely ignored. The mind that evaluates evidence is the same mind that has already decided what it wants to find, and it is extraordinarily good at finding exactly that. In the next part, we examine the two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self, and why the self that makes your decisions has never actually lived a single moment of your life. There is a distinction at the heart of Kahneman's later work that's perhaps the most philosophically unsettling of all the insights in Thinking Fast and Slow. Unsettling not merely because it challenges a professional assumption or a cognitive habit, but because it challenges something far more fundamental: the assumption that the self who evaluates your life, who decides whether your choices have been good ones, who determines what you want in the future based on what you have valued in the past, is the same self who actually lived the experiences that form the basis of those evaluations. Kahneman's research reveals that it is not, that there are, in the functional sense that matters for decision-making, two distinct selves operating within every human being: the experiencing self, which lives in the present moment, registering the actual hedonic quality of experience as it unfolds second by second through time, and the remembering self, which constructs and maintains the narrative of a life, evaluates past experiences as episodes with overall qualities, and makes decisions about the future based on those evaluations. These two selves do not merely have different perspectives on the same reality. They operate by different rules, weight evidence differently, and systematically disagree about the value of experiences in ways that produce some of the most consequential and most poorly understood decision errors in human life.
The experiencing self lives in what psychologists call the psychological present, the approximately 3-second window of conscious awareness within which sensory experience is directly registered as occurring now rather than as a memory of something that occurred within this window. The experiencing self registers the actual hedonic quality of experience with considerable accuracy, the intensity of pleasure or pain, the quality of engagement or boredom, the presence or absence of positive affect. But the experiencing self has no narrative capacity. It does not construct stories about experiences, does not evaluate episodes as wholes, and does not maintain a cumulative account of past experiences that can be consulted when making decisions about future ones. It exists entirely in the present moment, with no access to the past it has lived, and no influence over the future decisions that will determine what it experiences next. Its testimony about the quality of life as it is actually lived is the most accurate available, and it is almost entirely ignored.
Decision-making architecture that determines what experiences will be pursued and which will be avoided. The remembering self is the self that speaks when you are asked how your vacation was, how your career has been going, whether your relationship is satisfying, or whether your life is going well. It constructs its answer not from a comprehensive sampling of the experiencing self's moment-by-moment hedonic record, but from a radically compressed summary governed by two principles that Kahneman identifies as the peak-end rule and duration neglect. The peak-end rule states that the remembering self's evaluation of an experience is determined primarily by two data points: the peak intensity of the experience, whether positive or negative, and the quality of the experience at its end, with the vast middle duration of the experience contributing negligibly to the overall evaluation. Duration neglect states that the length of an experience has almost no effect on the remembering self's evaluation of it. A 10-minute version of an experience and a 60-minute version of the same experience will receive nearly identical overall evaluations if their peak and end qualities are equivalent, despite the fact that the experiencing self lived through 6 times as much actual hedonic content in the longer version. The empirical demonstration of these principles that Kahneman considers most revealing involved a medical procedure, colonoscopy, during which patients experienced varying levels of pain at different points in the procedure. Patients whose procedures ended with a period of reduced pain, even if the total duration of discomfort was longer, rated the overall experience as significantly less aversive than patients whose procedures ended at a peak of pain intensity, despite having experienced more total discomfort by any objective measure. The remembering self's evaluation was governed entirely by the peak-end rule and was completely insensitive to the duration difference, a demonstration of duration neglect so stark that it permanently restructured the understanding of how remembered experience is constructed and how those constructions determine future choices. For the executive and the strategic professional, the implications of this two-self architecture extend far beyond personal well-being into the core of how organizational experiences, customer relationships, and professional interactions are designed and managed. Every customer experience is evaluated not by the average quality of its moment-by-moment hedonic content, but by the peak intensity of the most emotionally significant moment and the quality of the ending, a principle with immediate operational implications for the design of service experiences, product interactions, and client relationships. The organization that understands the peak-end rule designs its customer touchpoints not to maximize average satisfaction across the full duration of the interaction, but to engineer a memorable peak and strong positive endings, even at the cost of reduced average quality in the middle portions of the experience that duration neglect will render effectively invisible in the remembering self's retrospective evaluation. In professional relationship management, the same principle applies with equal force. The colleague, client, or counterpart who evaluates their relationship with you or your organization is not averaging the quality of every interaction across the full history of the relationship. They're constructing a narrative from the most emotionally intense moments and the most recent ones, a narrative that the peak end rule and duration neglect have shaped into something that may bear very limited resemblance to the actual distribution of interaction quality across the relationship's full duration. The professional who understands this constructs their relationship management strategy around the deliberate engineering of peak moments and strong endings, ensuring that the remembering self's narrative of the relationship is built from the highest quality material available, rather than allowing it to be constructed from whatever emotionally salient moments the relationship happened to produce without deliberate design. The self that decides your future has never lived a moment of your past. It has only read the summary, and it wrote that summary itself from a handful of peaks and an ending. In the next part, we examine how System 1 operates in negotiation and social influence, the specific mechanisms through which your automatic mind is read, predicted, and directed by those who understand its architecture better than you do. There is a dimension of every high-stakes professional interaction that the majority of participants are not aware they are navigating, a dimension that operates below the threshold of conscious strategic awareness, that determines outcomes before the explicit content of the negotiation has been meaningfully engaged, and that is accessible to exploitation by any counterpart who understands the System 1 architecture well enough to deploy its mechanisms with precision and intentionality. This dimension is not charisma, not persuasion in the conventional sense, and not the application of professional training programs teach tactical negotiating frameworks. It is the deliberate engineering of the cognitive environment within which your counterpart's System 1 will operate, the construction of associative contexts, emotional primes, reference points, and narrative frames that shape the automatic processing of every subsequent piece of information your counterpart receives.
Encounters in the interaction before their System 2 has the opportunity to engage analytically with any of it. The professional who understands this dimension is not merely a better negotiator in the tactical sense. They are operating in a strategic layer that is invisible to their counterpart, and that determines the psychological landscape within which every explicit tactical exchange takes place. The first mechanism through which System 1 is exploited in negotiation contexts is priming, the deliberate activation of associative networks that make specific concepts, emotions, and behavioral dispositions more cognitively accessible before the substantive content of the negotiation begins. Priming operates through every channel of the interaction environment simultaneously: the physical space in which the negotiation occurs, the language used in pre-negotiation communication, the sequence in which topics are introduced, the emotional tone established in opening exchanges, and the incidental details of the presentation materials used to frame the substance of the discussion. Each of these channels activates associative networks in the counterpart's System 1 that will continue influencing their processing of subsequent information long after the priming stimulus has passed from conscious awareness. The negotiator who arrives at a meeting having sent advance materials framed around concepts of partnership, shared value creation, and long-term relationship has primed their counterpart's associative network with concepts that make collaborative processing more accessible and adversarial processing less so, not through the explicit content of those materials, but through the associative activation their language has triggered in a System 1 that cannot distinguish between a deliberate prime and an incidental contextual feature. The second mechanism is the strategic manipulation of reference points, the deliberate construction of the psychological baseline from which gains and losses will be evaluated throughout the negotiation.
As prospect theory established, the experience of any outcome as a gain or a loss is determined entirely by its relationship to the reference point from which it is evaluated, and the loss aversion asymmetry means that outcomes experienced as losses generate approximately twice the motivational force of equivalent outcomes experienced as gains. The negotiator who controls the reference point controls the psychological valence of every outcome in the negotiation space, and reference point control is achieved through the strategic deployment of anchors, framing choices, and concession sequences that establish the evaluative baseline before the counterpart has consciously recognized that a baseline is being established. The opening anchor sets an initial reference point, the framing of subsequent offers as departures from that anchor rather than as independent proposals maintains the anchor's gravitational influence, and the sequencing of concessions to end on a gain relative to the established reference point exploits the peak end rule to ensure that the remembering self's evaluation of the negotiation outcome is shaped by
the valence of the final concession rather than by the cumulative content of the full exchange. The third mechanism is the exploitation of the cognitive ease principle, the deliberate construction of a presentation and communication style that minimizes the cognitive friction the counterpart's System 1 experiences when processing the negotiator's proposals, thereby reducing the threshold for the System 2 engagement and the critical scrutiny it would apply. Proposals presented in clear, simple language with a logical structure that matches the counterpart's existing mental models in a physical format that processes fluently without effort will be evaluated with less critical scrutiny than equivalent proposals presented in complex language with an unfamiliar structure in a difficult-to-process format, not because the content is more credible, but because the cognitive ease of processing generates the implicit endorsement that System 1 delivers to all fluently processed information. The sophisticated negotiator who presents proposals in the simplest possible terms, with the clearest possible structure, and with the maximum possible correspondence to their counterpart's existing conceptual framework, is not merely being clear for the sake of communication efficiency. They are engineering the cognitive ease that reduces System 2 engagement and allows their proposals to be evaluated with the minimum possible analytical scrutiny. The fourth mechanism is the deliberate management of the counterpart's cognitive load, the strategic deployment of complexity, time pressure, emotional intensity, and information volume at moments when reducing the counterpart's available System 2 resources serves the negotiator's interests. System 2's analytical capacity is a finite resource that degrades under conditions of cognitive overload, emotional arousal, time pressure, and decision fatigue, all of which reduce the threshold below which System 1's automatic outputs are accepted without deliberate analytical override. The negotiator who introduces new complex terms late in a long negotiation session, who creates artificial time pressure at the moment when a critical concession is being requested, who deploys emotionally provocative framing at the precise moment when analytical clarity is most needed, is not being aggressive or unprofessional in any conventionally detectable sense. They are systematically depleting the System 2 resources that would otherwise apply critical scrutiny to the decisions being made, and the counterpart who does not understand this mechanism will experience the resulting decisions as freely chosen rather than as the product of a cognitive environment that was deliberately engineered to produce them. Understanding these mechanisms does not merely make you a more effective practitioner of influence, it makes you a more effective defender against it, capable of recognizing the priming effects, reference point manipulations, cognitive ease, engineering, and cognitive load management that are being deployed against you in every high-stakes interaction, and of building the structural defenses that prevent them from operating on your System 1 without your conscious awareness and consent.
The negotiation begins before the first word is spoken, and the professional who does not know that has already lost the layer that matters most. In the final part, we close the complete arc of thinking fast and slow, the integration of both systems into a disciplined cognitive practice, and what it means to live and decide with full awareness of the architecture that governs everything. Part 13. Activating System 2, the protocol for decision-making under pressure. There is a gap between knowing that System 2 exists and actually deploying it at the moments that matter most, a gap that is wider, more consequential, and more resistant to closure through conventional professional development than any other gap in the cognitive toolkit of the high-stakes decision-maker. It is not a gap of knowledge. The professional who has engaged seriously with Kahneman's framework understands, at the level of explicit propositional knowledge, that System 1 is automatic, that System 2 is lazy, and the interaction between them produces systematic and predictable errors, and that those errors are most consequential precisely at the moments of highest pressure, highest stakes, and highest cognitive load. The moments when System 2's analytical engagement is most needed and most reliably suppressed by the neurochemical dynamics that high-stakes pressure produces. Knowing this does not close the gap, it merely defines it with greater precision. Closing it requires something fundamentally different from knowledge. It requires the construction of structural interventions, environmental designs, and pre-committed protocols that generate System 2 engagement automatically at the moments when it is most needed without depending on the in-the-moment conscious recognition and deliberate override that System 1's dominance makes unavailable precisely when it would be most valuable. The first structural intervention is what decision scientists call a decision journal, a systematic practice of recording, before outcomes are known, the explicit reasoning behind significant decisions, the alternatives that were considered and rejected, the evidence that was weighted most heavily, the uncertainty that was acknowledged, and the specific predictions being made about how the decision will unfold. This practice serves multiple functions simultaneously within the framework of System 2 activation. It forces the engagement of System 2's analytical machinery at the moments that it matters most. Moment of decision, because the act of articulating reasoning in written form requires the kind of explicit, sequential, effortful processing that System 2 provides, and System 1 cannot. It creates an objective record that defeats the hindsight bias and confirmation bias that the remembering self would otherwise apply to the retrospective evaluation of the decision. And it generates a database of prior decisions and their outcomes that provides the base rate information that reference class forecasting requires, the outside view data that corrects the planning fallacy's inside view optimism with the statistical reality of how similar decisions have actually played out across the full historical record. The second structural intervention is the pre-mortem, a decision protocol developed by the psychologist Gary Klein and strongly endorsed by Kahneman as one of the most practically effective techniques for generating System 2 engagement in the planning contexts where the planning fallacy and overconfidence bias produce their most damaging effects. The pre-mortem inverts the conventional planning evaluation process by asking decision-makers, before a plan is finalized, to assume that the plan has been implemented and has failed, and to spend a specific dedicated period of time generating the most plausible and most detailed explanation possible for that failure. This inversion serves a specific cognitive function. It converts the social and psychological dynamics of the planning context from ones that suppress doubt and reward optimism into ones that license and reward the articulation of concerns, creating the psychological safety for System 2's critical analytical engagement that the conventional planning context systematically suppresses.
The pre-mortem does not eliminate optimism from planning. It channels the overconfidence that the planning context naturally generates into the identification of the specific failure modes that overconfidence is most likely to produce, and the identification of those failure modes is the prerequisite for the structural mitigations that can reduce their probability. The third structural intervention operates at the level of the decision environment rather than the decision process, the deliberate design of the physical, temporal, and social context within which significant decisions are made to maximize the conditions that support System 2 engagement and minimize the conditions that suppress it. Decisions made under time pressure show dramatically reduced System 2 engagement relative to equivalent decisions made without time pressure, a finding that supports the structural practice of building mandatory deliberation periods into every significant decision process, periods that cannot be collapsed by urgency framing, regardless of the perceived stakes of the decision. Decisions made in states of cognitive depletion, after long periods of demanding mental work, after extended social interaction, after the resolution of multiple prior decisions in the same session, show reduced System 2 quality relative to decisions made in states of cognitive freshness, supporting the structural practice of scheduling
Most consequential decisions for periods of maximum cognitive resources and protecting those periods from the depletion that sequential decision-making produces. The fourth structural intervention is the construction of what Kahneman calls a reference group of trusted critics, individuals whose analytical capabilities are respected, whose perspectives are genuinely different from one's own, and whose relationship to the decision-maker creates both the psychological safety to articulate dissenting views and the social accountability to do so honestly rather than diplomatically. The value of this reference group is not primarily the additional information they provide, it is the System 2 engagement their presence requires. The necessity of articulating and defending a decision to a genuinely critical audience forces the kind of explicit, rigorous, comprehensive analytical engagement that System 2 is capable of, but that its chronic laziness prevents in the absence of external accountability. The decision that has been subjected to genuine critical scrutiny by a well-constructed reference group is not merely a decision that has been improved by the incorporation of additional perspectives. It is a decision that has been constructed through a process that systematically activates System 2 at every stage, a process whose cognitive quality is structurally superior to any individual decision process, however analytically sophisticated the individual conducting it. The integration of these structural interventions into a consistent decision practice does not produce perfect judgment. It produces judgment that is systematically less distorted by the automatic biases of System 1, more accurately calibrated to the actual probability distributions of relevant outcomes, more genuinely informed by the full range of available evidence, and more robustly tested against the failure modes that overconfidence and inside view planning consistently generate. In competitive environments, where the quality of judgment is the primary determinant of strategic performance, this systematic improvement compounds across every decision cycle, producing not merely better individual decisions, but a cumulative advantage in decision quality that is the most durable and most defensible competitive position available to any professional operating at the highest levels of their domain. System 2 does not activate itself. Build the structures that activate it for you, because the moments when you most need it are precisely the moments when you are least capable of choosing it. In the final part, we close the complete arc of thinking fast and slow, what it means to carry this framework forward as a permanent cognitive discipline, and the responsibility that full awareness of your own mental architecture places on every. There is a final question that every serious engagement with Kahneman's framework must eventually confront, a question that goes beyond the correction of cognitive bias, beyond the optimization of individual decision quality,
and beyond the competitive advantages that a more accurately calibrated mind produces in professional environments where judgment is the primary currency of performance. It is the question of what changes when you can no longer claim ignorance of the architecture that governs your own thinking. When you have seen, with sufficient clarity and sufficient empirical grounding, the mechanisms through which System 1 constructs your perceptions, shapes your evaluations, distorts your probability assessments, corrupts your evidence evaluation, and delivers its automatic conclusions to consciousness dressed in the phenomenological clothing of rational deliberation. The question is not, what do you now know? The question is, what does knowing this demand of you, as a professional whose decisions affect others, as a leader whose cognitive architecture shapes the cognitive culture of the organization around them, and as a human being whose understanding of the limits of their own judgment carries moral implications that extend beyond the domain of strategic performance optimization. Kahneman himself was explicit about the limits of what his framework could accomplish at the level of individual cognitive correction. And the explicitness was not false modesty. It was a precise empirical claim grounded in the same research tradition that produced the framework itself. The biases documented in Thinking Fast and Slow are not correctable through awareness alone. Knowing that the anchoring effect exists does not neutralize its operation when you encounter a powerful anchor in a real negotiation. Knowing that loss aversion produces risk-seeking behavior in the loss domain does not prevent the value function's asymmetry from shaping your response to a real financial loss. Knowing that the halo effect distorts your evaluation of new people does not prevent the initial affective response from contaminating your subsequent dimension-specific assessments. The biases operate below the level at which conscious knowledge can intervene in real time, and the professional who believes that intellectual understanding of these mechanisms is sufficient to correct their operation in the moment of their activation is making an overconfidence error about the power of their own System 2 that is itself a demonstration of the bias they believe they have transcended. What awareness does accomplish, and what it accomplishes with sufficient power to justify the full investment this framework requires, is the capacity to build the structural interventions, the decision protocols, the environmental designs, and the organizational cultures that correct for these biases at the architectural level, rather
than at the level of individual in-the-moment conscious effort. The professional who understands the anchoring effect builds negotiation preparation protocols that generate independent valuations before any anchor can be encountered. The investment committee that understands loss aversion designs its portfolio review processes to evaluate positions based on forward-looking expected value rather than on the reference point of acquisition cost. The organization that understands the halo effect structures its talent evaluation processes to generate independent dimension-specific assessments before any global evaluation is formed. In each case, the knowledge does not correct the bias directly, it enables the design of structures that correct it indirectly, at the level of process architecture rather than at individual cognitive effort. The leadership dimension of this responsibility is where the leverage of Kahneman's framework is highest and where its implications are most demanding. The professional who understands their own cognitive architecture is not merely a more accurate individual decision-maker, they are a designer of cognitive environments, environments whose structure either amplifies or corrects for the systematic biases that operate in every member of every team and organization within their sphere of influence. The leader who communicates in ways that prime System 1 toward collaborative processing shapes the cognitive environment of their organization's processes. The leader who builds decision processes with mandatory deliberation periods and genuine pre-mortem protocols shapes the System 2 engagement quality of their organization's most consequential choices. The leader who creates psychological safety for the articulation of dissenting views shapes the confirmation bias dynamics of their organization's information flows.
each of these leadership behaviors is not merely a management practice, it is a cognitive architecture decision whose effects propagate through every level of the organization that the leader's choices shape. The final responsibility that Kahneman's framework confers is perhaps the most demanding: the responsibility of epistemic humility about the reliability of one's own judgment, maintained not as a temporary corrective posture adopted in response to a specific failure, but as a permanent feature of the cognitive stance with which every significant decision is approached. This is not the humility of self-doubt or the paralysis of chronic uncertainty. It is the precise, calibrated recognition that the cognitive system through which all judgment is formed is a system with known systematic limitations, limitations that are not eliminated by intelligence, not corrected by experience, not transcended by expertise, and not neutralized by awareness, and that the professional obligation of anyone who understands these limitations is to build the structural mitigations that account for them, rather than to proceed as if understanding them were equivalent to having overcome them.
The two systems will always be there. System 1 generating its automatic, confident, largely invisible conclusions, and System 2 choosing, with varying degrees of success, when to engage, how deeply to probe, and when to accept the outputs that the faster system delivers. The question that Thinking Fast and Slow leaves you with is not which system to trust. It is how to build a life and a professional practice that deploys both systems with sufficient wisdom to compensate for the limitations of each, that uses System 1's speed and pattern recognition where they are genuinely reliable, that deploys System 2's analytical power where the stakes and the complexity actually warrant its metabolic cost, and that builds the structural safeguards that prevent either system from operating unchecked in the domains where its unchecked operation produces the most systematic and the most consequential harm. You now know how your mind works. What you do with that knowledge is the only decision that this framework cannot make for you.